justified his own actions by repeating the worst rumors about Vitellius' excesses in order to portray himself as a savior. And so Roman scholars became steeped in Vespasian's version of who did what to who, why, and how. Tacitus may have published his account well after the death of Domitian, but his early career was influenced by first Vespasian and then Titus, and it is understandable that he portrayed Vitellius in less than Flavian propaganda that Vitellius is up against. Suetonius' father fought with the Othonians at Bedriacum, and if you think that the father had anything good to say to the son about the gluttonous usurper from Germania, well, you haven't read 12 Caesars. This is all to say that the caricature of Vitellius that has been handed down to us may bear only a passing resemblance to the man himself. That being said, though, it sure is a fun caricature, so let's just roll with it. It took Vitellius 6 weeks to wind his way down to Rome, leading his army from the Rhine on a meandering, debauched road trip. With some 60,000 soldiers, followers, and hangers-on accompanying him, discipline was lax, and the toll taken on the towns they passed high. Along the way, the new emperor detoured to the battlefield at Bedriacum, and pronounced the stench of death that still hung over the field sweet to his nose. He then swung by Otho's modest burial site, and pronounced it a small grave for a small man. Then, he went back to his traveling party and got drunk. See, isn't this Vitellius fun? He finally arrived in Rome in June, and had every intention of marching into the capital in full triumphal regalia, but was reminded that it would be in really, really poor form to celebrate victory over his fellow Romans, so he entered the gates dressed in a simple civilian toga instead. The actual reign of Vitellius is not particularly well documented, but the general consensus is that while Vitellius banqueted 4 times a day, attended the races, and then slept it off, Valens and Caecina were left in control of the day-to-day operations. Partners in war, however, the two became bitter enemies in peace, and nothing so defined the Vitellian regime as the rivalry between Valens and Caecina. Every appointment, every assignment, every appropriation became a cause worth fighting for. They both stacked the reorganized legions, civil service, and Praetorian Guard with their own clients, so that every level of every department became a front in their running political war. In the end, Valens would win the war for influence, leading Caecina to famously betray his third emperor in 15 months. The Vitellian regime was unable to accomplish that much in their brief time at the helm. They raised some taxes, threw some games, and tried to manage 4 emperors' worth of consular promises in an effort to keep the nobility happy. But between the first battle of Bedriacum in April and the second in October, it's not like they had a lot of time to work with. The only really significant thing they did upon taking office was to disband the existing Praetorian Guard and then reform it using their own troops to ensure that all the Othonian loyalists were purged. This was maybe a good idea and maybe not, but the final upshot was that all the best troops were siphoned out of the Rhine legions, so when Caecina headed north to face Antonius' invading army, the force he led was not the same army he had led against Otho. Oh, and all those fired Praetorians? When they heard that the legions of the East were promising to topple Vitellius, guess whose banner they all flocked to? So the reformation of the Praetorians may have seemed like a good idea at the time, but all it ultimately did was weaken Vitellius and strengthen Vespasian. So yeah, maybe not such a good idea. Speaking of Vespasian, when we last left him, he was in the process of putting down the Great Jewish Revolt, specifically contemplating when and how he was going to take Jerusalem. But when news of Nero's suicide arrived, he put the brakes on the campaign, unsure of whether Galba planned to adopt a harsh or lenient posture towards the Jews. Plus, as one of Nero's appointees, he had every reason to fear that Galba would recall him from his post. So he wrote the new emperor a friendly letter, pledging loyalty and requesting instructions. Fearing the worst when Galba ignored his overture, Vespasian sent his 28-year-old son Titus to Rome to feel Galba out. But before Titus could arrive, he received news of Galba's assassination and decided to turn back rather than allow himself to become a pawn in the brewing war between Otho and Vitellius. Vespasian commended his son's decision and then began to mull over what to do. Obviously, he should try to keep himself at arm's length from the conflict between Otho and Vitellius and wait to see how it played out. He was obligated to swear loyalty to Otho, of course, but that did not mean that he had to lift a finger to help him. So Vespasian settled back to wait for further news from the west. While he waited, though, a thought began to form in his head. Back home, every two-bit general with a legion at his disposal was making his bid for power. What makes them so much more qualified than, me? The future king of the world will come from Judea, the prophecy had said. Vespasian was beginning to think that he could make that prophecy come true. But that is not to say that this was all Vespasian's idea. Gaius Licinius Mucianus, the governor of Syria, had gone as high as he could hope to go in public life under existing conditions, and was dissatisfied with how low a height it was. Stuck in the largely diplomatic post of Syria, he was in danger of passing his whole life without ever tasting military glory, and was determined to rectify that situation. Mucianus saw in the mild, capable, and well-liked Vespasian the perfect vehicle for his ambitions, so he became an early prodder of Vespasian's growing ego and an active supporter once the future emperor finally decided to go for it. The other key prodder of Vespasian was Tiberius Julius Alexander, the Jewish-born prefect of Egypt. Appointed by Nero, events in the west had unfolded too rapidly for either Galba or Otho to replace him, so he and his two legions continued their administration in Alexandria well into Vitellius' reign. Having no love for Vitellius, and knowing full well that the new emperor would likely replace him and possibly execute him at the first opportunity, Alexander began a secret correspondence with Vespasian, pledging his support and his legions if Vespasian decided to, do something. The two legions were nice, but the real prize here was that Egypt was still a key agricultural engine of the empire. Any invasion of Italy that was coupled with a strangling off of the grain supply did not necessarily guarantee victory, see Antony, Mark, but it sure upped the percentage. Both Mucianus and Alexander were ready to declare for Vespasian immediately, but the future emperor was a deliberate man, and as spring turned to summer, he had still not yet announced whether or not he was going to lead the armies of the east in revolt. The impatient Alexander decided Vespasian just needed a swift kick to get going, so the prefect of Egypt went ahead and administered an oath of loyalty to Vespasian to his legions on July the 1st. A few days later, Vespasian's armies in Judea heard the news, and when their general emerged from his tent, a collection of them casually hailed him as emperor. With the cat now out of the bag, Vespasian decided to let it roam free. On July 15, Mucianus administered the oath to the legions of Syria and went to work convincing the legions in the Balkans to join them. In the process of being punished by Vitellius for their support of Otho, the troops in the Balkans were more than happy to join in the fight. In short order, Vespasian had the whole of the Eastern Empire lined up behind him. Vitellius, meanwhile, was still taking his victory lap. The Flavian plan was for Vespasian to remain behind in the east while Mucianus led an invasion of the west. Taking up residence in Alexandria, Vespasian would be able to personally oversee the all-important province of Egypt while remaining perfectly situated to reinforce his invasion force should they need support. After receiving assurances from the Parthians that they would not stir up trouble along the border, Mucianus set out west with a force of about 18,000 troops. Along the way, he was supposed to pick up the Balkan legions, and then, when he got near Italy, put out the call to the demobilized Othonian troops to flock to Vespasian's banner. But things did not exactly go according to plan. The commanders of the 5 legions stationed in the Balkans were eager to take their revenge on Vitellius, but not as eager as the troops themselves. The officers stated flatly that the plan was to wait for Mucianus, so that's what they were going to do. Seeing an opportunity to bathe himself in glory, though, Marcus Antonius Primus broke with his colleagues and argued that they should immediately invade Italy while the Vitellian troops were still drunk with victory. The troops couldn't have agreed more and elected Antonius their new general. Instead of waiting for Mucianus to arrive, Antonius went off the reservation and led the legions now under his command into Italy. In other words, the army that ultimately won the war for Vespasian was never authorized to do what it did. When Vitellius learned that a Flavian army was marching on Italy, he dispatched Caecina to stop their advance. The emperor no doubt would have sent Valens as well, but the elder general was recovering from an illness at the time and was unable to make the trip. For Caecina, this presented a golden opportunity. In the months since he had helped Vitellius become emperor, the young noble had found himself increasingly ignored, while Valens emerged as the far more influential advisor. Whenever Valens and Caecina disagreed over some issue or another, Vitellius generally backed Valens. Deeply unhappy with his position, Caecina marched north at the head of the Vitellian legions, thinking deeply not about battle plans, but whether or not he should defect to Vespasian. He had already been in contact with the commander of the Vitellian naval fleet stationed at Ravenna, and the commander there had assured Caecina that he was going over to Vespasian at the first opportunity. Caecina, he said, should join him on the winning team. Antonius arrived in Italy with his advance guard in October, and was greeted by a much stronger force led by Caecina. But rather than attack as his men expected, Caecina opened negotiations with Antonius, hinting elliptically that he was willing to betray Vitellius if the terms were right. While he negotiated, the rest of Antonius's troops arrived, negating the numerical advantage that the Vitellians had once had, leading the men under Caecina's command to wonder just what their general was up to. Not long after that, though, they got their answer. Messengers arrived with the news that the Ravenna fleet had defected to Vespasian. Caecina called together his officers and announced that it was hopeless to fight the Flavian onslaught. The whole empire was turning against Vitellius, and they had better join the winning side before they all found their heads on the chopping block. He managed to convince the officers, but when the regular troops learned of the betrayal, they stormed the tent and threw the shocked and sputtering Caecina into chains. The men elected new generals and abandoned the position they had held near Antonius's base in Verona. Antonius woke up the next morning and discovered the army he thought was about to join him had suddenly disappeared into the night. But not one to delay, Antonius marched straight away for Bedriacum, where he planned to make a camp from which to launch an assault on Cremona, the Vitellian base of operations in North Italy. Caecina's army had already made for Cremona following their general's aborted defection, and now waited nervously for Antonius to arrive. In a few days, the two sides would meet in one of the rarest sights in the ancient world, a night battle. Marching in from the east on October the 24th, Antonius's army was disrupted by a Vitellian cavalry attack, and a brief skirmish ensued that saw the Vitellians driven off. The Flavian army kept marching, but they were unable to reach the full Vitellian force until late in the afternoon. Flushed with victory, the Flavians refused to retire from the field. For their part, the Vitellians were so close to the safety of Cremona that they figured that if things got too hairy, they could just make a run for it, so they too refused to retire for the evening. For the next 10 hours, the two armies fought a sporadic and bloody battle through the night that was still undecided when the sun rose the next morning. In a quirky twist of fate, though, the Vitellians lost heart when they saw one of the Flavian legions turn east and clearly greet the arrival of reinforcements. Exhausted from the battle, the Vitellians fled back to the safety of Cremona to wait for their own reinforcements. Except that there were no Flavian reinforcements. Having spent years stationed in the east, the legion in question had adopted a local custom of greeting the sun as it rose.